All Things Alice. This podcast will explore the cultural phenomenon of Alice in Wonderland as artistic landmark and global symbol of inspiration and imagination. I'm your host, Frank Beddor, the author of the Looking Glass Wars trilogy. Let's explore, what is it about Alice? My next guest is a collaborator and is co-writing my latest novel in the Looking Glass Wars universe, David Rutsala. He was raised in a literary family and has worked for over a decade developing film, television, and publishing properties for most of the major studios, networks, and publishers. His films have played across the globe, including at prominent venues like the Museum of Modern Art, Sundance, the Berlin Film Festival, and Cannes. And recently, he has co-founded the Permanent Majority PAC, a progressive organization devoted to establishing a permanent majority for the Democratic Party. I'm super excited to have you on the show. Welcome, my friend. I'm super happy to switch this over where I get to ask you questions.
Yeah, because for those of you who don't know, I've been doing some interviews with Frank for a big series of articles that will be coming out soon about the whole history of the Looking Glass Wars, and it's going to be very cool. And everyone who's listening is going to want to read that stuff.
And I'm excited to chat with David today because we have been collaborating for many, many years in all sorts of different aspects of the Looking Glass Wars and other projects. But one of the more rewarding parts of our working together, our collaboration, has been this novel of the Hatter graphic novels we will chat about. But before I go there, I want to do a little exploration. I'm really curious. I'm really into father-son stories, and I was quite close with my father, and my father was a big personality, and that caused me to need to separate myself from him and go off in my own direction. And I know that your father was a poet and a writer, and I was really curious about your relationship, with your dad, especially around writing. Like when you were in school, was he reading your work, or was that too close to home, so to
No, he was
speak?
always. My father was Vern Rutsala. He's a very well-known poet. He isn't with us anymore, but he wrote, I believe, over 20 books of poetry and then additional books of various things. And in the world of poetry, he's very famous. Outside the world of poetry, not so much. But yes, he was always like incredibly supportive. I remember I got into writing poetry in grade school, and he would help me type up the poems. And he would always read my stuff, and he was always very supportive. And he would often tell me, like, after I was an adult, like where I was stronger than he was, which, is a very supportive thing for somebody to tell you, someone who's that accomplished. And I mean, I think the thing that, but he was leading by example every day because, poetry isn't something where you make tons of money. I mean, it did help him. He was a college professor, and it did help him advance in his college. But you have to do it, you have to do it every day. And just seeing that example of the fact that he was living a life, but that he was also, so productive and so committed to something, it was a powerful lesson to me always. And then you get into the stuff I learned later, like that he didn't publish a book although he was publishing in magazines and periodicals, he didn't publish a book between 1961 and 1975. I talked to him about that later and about how hard that was, to have, because it wasn't like he wasn't sending books to publishers, how he had, to deal with basically like 15 years where you were not being recognized.
When you say it was difficult to deal with because your father would be emotional about the rejection of these books and the difficulty of getting somebody to say yes, or that you were just used to, your dad producing these books and being able to look at that as an example, and you were confused personally why that didn't continue?
Well, no, because after he published that second book, he published a book like every couple of years. So
Oh, I see.
like most of my memory of my childhood was of him publishing. But like now, later when I learned that there was this long period, and my mother even told me a story of like one of his books, that he was really, he had a really good feeling about the press that he'd sent it to. And I think he'd had some personal, discussions with the editors there, and they just rejected it like with a form rejection. And my mom said he like ran upstairs to like actually to his this room where I'm in now, and she was actually like frightened, like as to how, how he was taking that.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I saw, yeah, seeing your father in a vulnerable state really, really sticks with you because so often, that I rarely saw my dad. He seemed in control all the time.
Mm.
So that must have been a
And
bit.
my father was, he was an artist and a creative person, but he was also very much of a person of his time, a man of his era. I mean, he was somebody who, loved, I mean, he came from unlike my mother, he came from a working class family in Idaho. And he was the Marvel child who, was great at everything, did
Mm,
fantastic in school, was an athlete, all of those things. He was valedictorian, president of his senior
wow.
class,
Wow.
the quarterback of the football team.
Come
He was
on.
that.
Really? He was the
Yes, he was
quarterback
all
of.
of the football.
Wow. That is
And
a very unusual combination of a human. All those
yes,
skills.
and my mom, when she met him in college, he had become much more of this artistic, like beatnik sort of person. And she was shocked when she learned like that he'd had such a like, classic American high school experience, of this, you know, Joe High School type situation. And but as an adult, he loved, he watched sports, he liked to drink beer. He was so there. It wasn't like he was that different than my friends' parents, in many respects, But he also did this thing, and so I think that was very powerful to me, was that, he could be this, man of his time, but then he worked at night almost exclusively. And that he would sit there at his table and compose these things and just just keep doing that year after year. I mean, I believe that on the night he died, him and his mom, him and my mom, him and his mom, him and my mom, hello, hello, Sigmund Freud. um Him and my mom were like going over the galleys of his last book, so like, like an hour, or so before he died. So he was doing that, and that was his life. And I think when you see that, that's just a powerful lesson to you as a child, and to me going forward, just to know like what it takes, to be a creative person, that it's not like just this glamorous thing, that it's this consistent effort. And he always said to me, like, run your own race. Like that was one of his phrases. Like, it's not about what other people are doing. And that's something I always say to myself, like, you're running your own race. Like, don't worry.
And what was your first race with writing? Do you recall?
Well, I had an interest, like I wrote, I also drew a lot. So I drew and wrote for as long as I can remember, And my father also was quite a good artist. So he would often draw with me when I was very small. Um, but I mean, I did write like I think it was fifth grade, like I had written like a little book of poems that kind of became like famous at my school because like it even led to like parodies of them.
What was the
Because
theme? What was the theme of the of the poems? What were
the
you
one that
talking
people
about?
liked the most was this poem I wrote about my dog, called Soul of a Dog. And it was, I don't remember the lines, but I do remember what it was about. And it was about the fact that my dog, who was a gigantic collie, like a particularly big, like Lassie dog collie, but he was terrified of the mailbox, like the big, US, like
Mm-hmm.
that closing, that sound really.
Mm.
And so it was about that conflict of like this dog that was so big and powerful and a shepherd, in his behavior. And then he was terrified of this thing that to me was completely unfrightening.
Oh, that is so sweet. That sounds like an animated short wanting to
Yeah.
be made at Pixar or something.
Yes. And I remember I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and we have a system called outdoor school, which is like a camp for every kid. And it's sort of you learn about you learn about nature, but it's also basically a camp. You do all the camp stuff. And I remember, and you end up sharing a cabin with kids from all over the city. And I remember in my cabin, there was like another kid who was a writer. And so it was like his friends like were championing him and my friends were championing me. And they thought we'd have this big conflict. Of course, we had no, we were happy to like meet another writer.
It sounds a bit unrealistically idyllic for a writer not to suffer a little bit more. You have a great relationship with your father, who is there alongside of you creating. Your first possible competitor turns out to be a good friend. Has this continued?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, my parents, I mean, my mom was very important in this too, because my mom was really the one who ran the house, ran the family. She's from New England. She was from New England, and she was a very strong personality. And I had my parents, like, I didn't realize it growing up because they seem to allow so much, but like comparing my childhood to others, they were pretty strict, particularly my mother, about like what I could do and what I couldn't do.
For instance, what was something you couldn't do that you found to be strict?
Um, well, I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I'm like a rare person who doesn't ski, right? And that's because my mom wouldn't let me go.
Oh,
She just didn't. She just thought it was too dangerous.
right, right. Well,
So that kind of thing. It was mainly that. And there were sometimes like weird things, like although they were very open about books I read or movies I saw. I remember my mom never wanted me to watch Psycho. And I never quite, and like even I ended up like seeing it for the first time in high school, and my mom still wasn't happy about it.
it must have scared her.
Well, I think it scared her. I also think, my mom was like a feminist, and I also think the like violence and sex combination was something she didn't think was healthy for especially young people to
Yeah,
be exposed to.
and not the greatest mother,
Yeah, and also
character either.
definitely.
Well, so when was the transition into television, movies?
That happened very, very early, and that like it really happened. I went to first grade in the States, and then we moved to England, and I went to second grade in England, and it really happened that year. So it was 7 and 8, and I that was when I discovered Doctor Who and Star Trek, and those shows like got me interested in filmmaking. I discovered that book, The Making of Star Trek. Like one of my cousins had it, and I was I didn't even think that there was such a thing could exist, like a book. And it was like a paperback, but it had like all these photos in the center, and it
Cool
was thick.
pictures, yeah, of the
Yeah, it was like
sets and
64 photographs, like which is books back then often had that, like the little photos, but this was like a ton of them. And just the idea of a whole book devoted to how they made this show. I mean, nowadays we think, Star Trek is this big thing, but back then it had just recently gone off the air. It was just another show, right? And I didn't like the fandom hadn't really gotten to the point where people recognized that. So I was just one person that was getting into it. And while other people really got into wanting to live in that world, I think for me it was about how they made it, who this person Gene Roddenberry was, who were these writers that wrote it, these actors, and I got very interested in what the other actors did, and many of the episodes were written by science fiction writers. So then that got me into reading their short stories and novels.
And did you have friends in England that were into the same thing, or?
Yes, I had a lot of friends that were into that. I had a friend, one of my best friends was actually from Australia, and we would always argue about because I really liked the Jerry Anderson shows too, the puppet, those shows like the Thunderbirds and
No, I never saw that.
Stingray there's shows that have lots of like gadgets and aircraft, but the characters are all played by puppets, by
Oh,
marionette puppets. Uh, and I was into those, but my friend Robbie was like even more into them. We'd always argue about like which was better, Doctor Who or the Jerry Anderson shows.
hmm.
And I would always side with Doctor Who, and he would pick the Jerry Anderson shows. And and he also was really into the fact that I was an American, because he was also really into the space program. And he was always like, "Have you been to Cape Canaveral?"
That's
And I had,
awesome.
like, one of the things in England is people do not understand the size of America. Like, they do not get it. Like, to this day, like, they don't
Yeah.
get it. It's
Right. It's
like,
like just
I was
around
like,
the
well,
corner.
can't you just pop over there? And I'm like, it's 3,000 miles away. No, I can't pop over there.
Well, since we're on the topic of childhood discoveries, how did you just come to Alice in Wonderland? Or did you?
I was thinking about that, and it's so hard for me to, because my mother was always like quoting stuff, and she was always quoting Alice in Wonderland and other Lewis Carroll writings. But so it was always around. I do like have a memory of like the first time I think it was just read to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like rather than being read to like my siblings and me, that like
Oh,
at
okay.
bedtime, it was just being read to me. And I remember that like this opening sections, because I think I had sort of, it's one of those stories you can kind of dip in and out of. So like if I'd heard it being read to my sister or my brother, I might have heard, but like that opening section is so powerful with her falling down the hole and, drinking the potion. And I just remember being very like blown away by that.
Was that something that your parents did on a regular basis? That they read stories to you as a family and or individually? Because
Yeah,
that's pretty
that was
interesting.
something that was something my mother really did. I mean, occasionally my father would, but like that was really my mother was very theatrical, and so that was something she really liked to do. I mean, she would even read to my father, like in the evening and from the not always book, but from the newspaper, like, and he liked that.
What was her favorite? Did she have a favorite to act out and be theatrical, or do you recall a childhood favorite that she read to you?
I do remember, one of my like strong memories is of her reading to me Treasure Island.
Mm.
Um, And I remember like that was very like I could tell it was like a special thing. I don't know if this is still true, but there used to be a kind of thing of like when is the kid ready for Treasure Island,
Yeah.
especially young boys, because it's such a like classic boys adventure story. And I do remember like, and I didn't know anything about it. I hadn't seen the movie. So, or, at that stage. And, it's just such a magical like story, the way it opens, and it's scary. Like it feels like you're being given a new experience, right? Because it's kind of an adult thing, with like the black spot and this, there's scary stuff in there,
Yeah, it's
for
like
a child.
Grimm's fairy tales and so many other books that were written back then. I was a big fan of that of Treasure Island because it was scary, but of the adventure aspects. And I remember I was doing an interview with Michael Morpurgo, the British children's laureate, and he was giving me a hard time about reimagining Alice in Wonderland, but he finally came around. But he gave me a word of warning: don't touch Treasure Island. And I said, I'm putting it in space. Come on, give me a break. But of course,
They did do that, Treasure Planet.
yeah. Oh, they did? Oh, okay. Well, luckily I didn't work on it too late. So, but do you have one that you would, a classic that you ever thought about
I do,
reimagining?
but like one of them is something I'm working on, so I don't
You
really
can't
want to
talk
talk
about
about
it?
it. Can't really
Oh,
talk about it.
oh, that's
It's
too
kind of
bad.
cool. We'll like it's not at a state. It's something I actually. It's one of the many things I worked on during the pandemic. Because I was one of the things that when that started, I was like, I'm not coming out of this with nothing accomplished. And as you know, I like for you, I accomplished something quite
Yes,
massive.
yes, massive.
Because
Your
that's when I
opus.
finally finished the book, and it's huge. So,
Well,
um,
let's just tell them, the listeners, talk a little bit about that because you just brought it up. And when you say it's massive, it's many many pages. So think Game of
I mean, it's
Thrones.
so it's like over 1,000 pages. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's an opus. So
and it was the I mean, that's the like that's the longest thing I've ever written, easily. But it wasn't. It never felt like that because it was just such a. It, first off, that was like it. What was else was going on? It was just the best escape,
well, let's get
right?
set up because what this is. This book
Okay. Well,
was it.
originally
Yeah, go.
Frank Frank came to me and he wanted to do something about the Hatter graphic novels because he'd noticed that there were some people who just didn't want to read graphic novels and they loved his novels. And he thought maybe we could do something, we could do just adapt them to basically do novelizations
Right.
of the graphic
Right.
novels.
Hmm.
And I think you were thinking about other people, and I like lobbied for myself really hard to
Hmm.
do it,
Hmm.
you know. And you were not totally convinced originally, but like I put, and I put together an outline for I think it was at that stage I think I had it as like maybe 3 books. And my notion was of at like was not just let's not I felt like the Alice energy needed to be in there in some respect. And so I created a new character who was like hunting Hatter, who was a teenage Victorian journalist who has her own backstory. And that was basically my addition to the structure. And then I found a way to use that to tell all the stories within the graphic novels and add new ones. And I recall you read that and you really liked it, but your big note, you had many notes, but your big note was it needs Alice.
Right.
And the minute like you said that, and it wasn't something we'd ever thought about, we'd ever put into words because that was what it wasn't, right? Like
Hmm.
initial conception, and I remember when I first talked to you about the Penelope character, I was saying like there's going to be a lot of Alice energy here and there, and like she'll be sort of an echo over the whole piece.
And she's the reporter, right?
That's the reporter, yeah. But still, you felt like it needed Alice, and the minute you said it, I knew you were right, and that meant one of the really exciting things that meant for me was we could expand um, one of the chapters in your first book about Alice on the streets of London, because that was my favorite chapter. It was many people's favorite chapters.
And also, I skipped over a number of her teenage years.
Hmm.
And so I thought, oh, that'd be really interesting to explore what was going on with her. But structurally, the idea that these two people are separated on planet Earth and they're slowly inching their way together just made sense.
And my like simple like one line on it always was Hatter searching for Alice, Penelope's searching for Hatter, and Alice is searching for herself. And that was always like that was the guiding thing. I think that's one of the reasons I could write such a long piece was because I always knew what it was about. Like I
Right.
always knew the motivation of the characters, where they like, because when you go off in sort of a one of these like picaresque style stories, one of the problems is often you lose the thread, right? But the strength of this material that you'd set up was that the thread was so strong that you would never lose it, right? Because Hatter's looking for Alice. You know, Penelope's a journalist. She's looking for Hatter. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
mysterious. What she doesn't even know he's Hatter for. You know, originally just
Mm-hmm.
this mysterious monster character that she hears of and reads of in European papers.
Yeah. Well, and along with the writing, because you have background in film, which I'd like you to talk about, but because you have that background of pitching and selling and creating TV and film properties, you have a really strong sense of how to position something, how to sell something. And I remember we were talking about a pitch I was going to do for the Looking Glass Wars, and you were helping simplify it. And one of the things that you came up with, and that I had also had very similar language, and it really surprised me, was what people are looking for today in terms of creating a new myth, but not a myth that has to do with good and evil. Of course, that's there, but a myth about truth versus fiction, and and to be able to crystallize thematically what these ideas are about and how they're going to find their way into pop culture. And I was curious if you learned that skill of positioning it from pitching to Hollywood, or had you always seen stories in terms of the way that the story is going to find its way into pop culture?
I mean, that's an interesting question. That's something I'm not entirely sure of. I know like there was something in my makeup that always was interested in the development side of ideas. And I remember like a few years ago, I encountered like one of my earliest attempts at writing a screenplay, and I was probably 12, and it was only about 10 pages, but it was a biopic about Tutankhamun. And I had done research, but I was impressed by the opening sequence because it showed that it was set with Tutankhamun at his inauguration. It's kind of like a backstage moment before he's presented to the court. And I was, and it's still a youthful person's writing, but the concept, I thought that's a very strong way to start that movie, right? Like that you have this boy king, and you're seeing him who we know through these like beautiful, like the sarcophagus and all that stuff, right? But you're seeing him stripped of everything, and so I must have, like, on some level that got some, just from watching lots of movies, reading lots, like some of that inherent like way of positioning a story was clearly in me. um and I mean, I did lots of writing. I started making movie, like, student films or children, when I was 8. So
Wow.
like my best friend who lived across the street from me, his mother was a taught film at the high school, one of the high schools. So she got us like really great equipment. We
Mm.
had lights,
Oh,
like,
that's so
my
much
first
fun.
film. Yeah. And it was it was like I was really into like detectives. It was the 70s, right? I was like there was lots of those detective shows. So it was like about I was the star and I was like the detective, and it didn't have much of a story, as these things generally don't.
Hmm.
But it was something that I got very excited about, and it became, that became a part of my life that hasn't ended, right? Like I've probably done some kind of film project um, every year since I was 8. And one of the things I often say to people is my life as a child in many respects was not that much different than my life is now. Like I had my projects. I was really into like office supplies. So I always had like folders and, I was, I was, I was that weird little kid, that, and I had friends that were into the same kind of stuff. And I remember I like really wanted like a manual upright typewriter from like the 40s, you
Wow,
know?
so specific.
Yeah. And there was like, there was like a used typewriter place like near my house, and I would go in there and I would look at the different ones, and they were really nice to me, like because they liked the fact that like such a little kid was into their stuff.
It's really amusing to me what you're saying because I think that what a lot of adults lose is that childhood, curiosity and imagining, and it sort of gets, beaten out of you because of the way that life is. And to be able to hold on to that and tell stories was one of the big themes that I was thinking about in Looking Glass Wars is the power of imagination. How do we hold on to that childhood imaginings and carry them into life so you can have, you can be responsible, but you can have a lot of joy and you can continue to have vivid stories and have vivid creativity. And that's not an easy thing to do for
No, it
folks.
isn't. I
So,
know that one of the like I went back. I I quit smoking 13 years ago, I guess, almost 14 now. And I remember I was thinking, like, am I going to be able to write? Because it was sort of like part of my
mhm, your shtick,
process.
yeah.
So one of the things I thought about was like, well, I always wrote. So just I go back to your inspirations like when you were 8. And that was like really valuable in ways that I didn't expect, because it reminded me of like how consistent my life had been, and what, my interests were always my interests, and it kind of like pushed something as mundane as smoking to the place that it belonged, which is just a mundane activity that wasn't healthy and I needed to stop.
So where do those inspirations to write and tell stories come from, or what did you what did you find to reignite the love of creating?
It got down to really basic stuff. It was like it was like H.P. Lovecraft, or
Hmm.
um Bradbury. Like it was like the science fiction and comic book. It was just those basic. Some of the art, I loved art. I did a lot of drawing and painting. So just going back to like looking at Da Vinci, like the things that got me excited about being alive and being a creative person. And even things like getting some of the actual like editions of books that I had from that period. That was, because that's a kind of a connection. Um, it wasn't that complicated when I started, I mean, it didn't take me a great deal of effort, and I think it ended up being a more powerful experience uh, than the reason I did it initially, because it made me realize, oh, like this isn't something like, because part of my brain, I think, said, well, because I pretty much started writing like daily when I was 22. So oftentimes I drew the line there. And I was like, when I started to go back to 8, I was remembering when I like tried to my first attempts to like write stories, and um, short stories, science fiction short stories. And I had read in one of those like writer's handbooks that they paid by the word. And I remember like counting the words in my notebook.
Okay, that's funny. It's figuring out how much money you're making. Yeah, I wish it was. I wish it was that easy. I mean, I think there's still some writer jobs that you get paid by the word, but
No, actually those magazines still, the ones of the, that still exist, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Analog and Asimov's, which came later, but all those still pay by the word.
hey, let me ask you. Since working on the Looking Glass Wars and sort of taking this deep dive into Alice in Wonderland, have you noticed how much Alice in pop culture there is to draw upon, or how often it's referenced? Um,
Yeah, I mean that was rather stunning to me. Like I would have probably imagined it was strong and present, but it's just everywhere. Like literally almost a day does not go by when there I do not encounter a reference to it, you know. And there were so many down the rabbit hole. Like you hear that almost every day
Yeah.
nowadays because it's become like people go down a YouTube rabbit hole, go down a internet rabbit, an Instagram rabbit hole, you know, and I don't think they even that's one that's so ingrained in us. I don't think people are even thinking Alice in Wonderland. It's become that part of our way
Yeah.
of looking.
Yeah, and it often morphs. So, in the Matrix, they turned the liquid into pills. And then I read an article about taking the red pill, which was a whole article about the internet and
Mhm.
about how deep that rabbit hole goes in terms of, but they were using a Matrix invention to talk about Alice in Wonderland that was different. And so it keeps feeding on itself. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah, and through the looking glass, right? That's another one of those expressions that you hear a lot. But actual direct, uh, you know, um,
Quotes.
references and quotes are just as prevalent,
Yeah,
like as these overarching
curiouser and
themes.
curiouser. I've seen that.
That one, like I don't, and a lot of them exactly people don't know, and one of the articles, like another article I'm putting together for your site is like the connection, the Star Trek connection. And as I did a little research on that, I discovered that like Alice in Wonderland, its use in the original series and in Star Trek Discovery actually makes the Star Trek animated series canon or a section of it canon. So like that's an amazing thing. And I was going through like one of my old like Star Trek like reference books from like, and it was right around the time the animated series came out, and it even has like an entry for Lewis Carroll.
What would you say that because you're a fan of Star Trek, that Star Trek using Alice in Wonderland is one of your favorite connections to?
I think it is one of my favorites, and of course it's used in such an in so many in like these specifically different ways that evoke different things. And that's the thing about Alice in Wonderland, that it can be something that's we just are talking about the fantasy, right? Like that it's one example of a fantasy world.
Mm-hmm.
But then you can look at Alice in Wonderland as the opposite thing, which is it's like great fantasy. It's us looking at our world, right? It's a tool to examine our world. And I always love that in Oliver Stone's JFK when Costner as Jim Garrison says, "We're through the looking glass, people. Black is white and white is black," and like there it is. Like, and everybody like the great thing about that is everybody understand. Like, even if if they're not in, they're not going, "Oh, looking glass, Alice." Like, they're not doing that in their brain. They know that,
It's a shorthand. It's a shorthand. It's a vocabulary that we've developed around it, and that's why you don't really recognize it, or you can recognize it so quickly.
I honestly feel like going through this process of working on this material with you, that I think we have to say that it's right up there with Shakespeare and the Bible as like the most influential work of literature that like has been wedded so deeply into our culture that we don't even notice it.
Well, and also it keeps morphing from decade to decade in terms of whatever's going on in culture. It just takes a different form to represent what's in the forefront.
Right. As I said, going down a YouTube rabbit hole,
Yeah, it's
right?
so
Like that's,
pliable. It's
right.
amazing. I mean, how the longevity of it is just shocking.
Right.
It's
And especially when you think, Lewis Carroll like originally invents the story just to entertain some children. I mean, that's basically
No, no, that's not true. He did it because Alice Hart told him the story. Don't. Alice Hart told him
I'm
the
sorry, I
story. Yeah,
forgot
yeah,
that.
yeah. Don't fall into that trap of
Yeah,
buying
I
into
know,
it.
fake news.
Fake, fake news. I think another aspect of working together is the idea of, creating stories across these multiple platforms. And so, I
Mhm.
hadn't read a graphic novel. I hadn't written a graphic novel before. And so, I thought about the graphic novels that I've written and what I might have done differently in terms of the storytelling. But then when we started to collaborate, because I had written novels before, I thought, okay, this is another aspect of creating not necessarily a franchise, even though I'd be very happy to have, a franchisable, IP. But how much fun it is to cross pollinate stories in different mediums and for them to be connected and then extended and then have to write and create within the rules of the new medium. So whether you're
Mhm.
writing a novel, which you know about, and you also know about writing graphic novels because you wrote some scripts for me,
Mhm.
they're a different beast. So can you talk a little bit about the process and the creative process, when you're writing a novel versus when you're conceptualizing a graphic novel? Um,
Well, I think a graphic novel is very similar to television or or screenplays in that it's a very compressed form.
mhm.
And you can't like you have to be more conscious about like relaxing into the process and allowing your subconscious to take over because it's such a demanding form from a structural standpoint that almost everything is structure. So where and when writing a novel, structure is important. It's not as important. What's more important is the words itself and scene creation and character creation. So you can have much more of that relaxed creativity, um, and be much and take on your subconscious. I mean, I was working with even though your novel that I worked with you on expanded, in my drafting of it, I was working from a fairly tight outline. Um, and so that I always had something to go back to, but I didn't have to, it wasn't like writing a graphic novel or a screenplay where you're almost always thinking of like, oh, this, the thing is, whenever I start a screenplay, I always feel like it's too long. Like I've written a page, it's too long.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
like,
Well,
like
do you go past
because
120 pages?
well, I mean, but you already start to lay it out in your mind, and I mean, that was a thing that I learned fairly early. I read it in a book somewhere. It said like most scenes are no longer than 3 pages in the screenplay, and I was like, oh, really? Because if you read books, like often there's like 8 page scene, 12 page scene, 25 page scene. So you have that feeling, and in a novel you have much. It's you have that. There's this. It's a very wonderful experience to write a novel, I think, because you have this thing that you're doing, and it's not going to be done for a while, right?
And it's all on your shoulders. In
Yeah,
screenwriting, you're definitely collaborating. In
you're
comics,
and also you're not like that's not the final product.
exactly.
It's a
That's just the
means to
map.
make.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a means to make a thing, and that's one of the reasons I like it. I mean, I'm a person who likes to read plays, and I know a lot of people don't find them probably because they aren't the thing, right? They're a version of a
Hmm.
thing. But to me, that's very exciting. I like that feeling of like making it up in my head, and
Well, I loved plays as well because I was an actor for a short period of time, and I fell in love with the form, which was a reason I was interested in writing at all, because I thought it was just an amazing ability to tell this story through this dialogue and
yeah,
and nothing else. A little bit of stage direction, but
but
that
very. I mean,
that's
many like famous plays. There's almost no.
there's
Shakespeare has almost no stage
yeah.
direction.
So yeah, so all these different forms are quite challenging.
I mean, I think someone who is 100% a novelist may take exception with what I've said,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm talking about it from the perspective of someone who's primarily, like, I've always written fiction, but someone who's primarily been writing, in screenplays and teleplay type format. So, like, to me, in that format, the struggle is always to, and I use a lot of techniques to keep that subconscious creativity alive. Um,
What do you think it is about Alice in Wonderland that has endured in culture, but not quite endured in film and television in the same way, say, Sherlock Holmes has been done over and over and reinvented, and maybe even The Wizard of Oz. Alice, until the Tim Burton movie came out, I would say that 90% of the people, or a lot of the people anyway, would recognize the Disney animated movie, but that was from
yeah,
1945, I think, right?
yeah.
Other than that,
I mean, there have been other versions, there have been television specials, but you're absolutely right. I think some of it is just the daunting nature of like going up against Disney. I mean,
mm,
because we don't have, I mean, the Jungle Book had adaptations before, and there's only been a couple, like maybe like there was, I think, one in the 90s, you know, um, other than the Disney. And you look at that with Winnie the Pooh, right? Like, I mean, I think that's one they actually own because that's not in public domain. But of the what material they've done in public domain, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, they like not a lot of people have taken it on. I mean, we recently have, you know, Guillermo del Toro taking on Pinocchio, but it's, and a couple of other people have tried that. But it's that's part of it. I think the other thing is you're with Sherlock Holmes and Tarzan and things, you're talking about things that I think people saw more naturally as story generators. And they saw Alice more as one story,
no,
you know?
that's a good point. Story generators versus, you know, that her story, is episodic and it kind of comes to an end. And where do you go? I suppose
I mean, Wizard of Oz is another one that like there's multiple books, right? I read them
13,
all as a
13.
kid,
Mm-hmm.
and we only really have like we have like a couple of we have the Judy Garland movie, and then there's that Return to Oz movie from the 80s. But there's I think there's like an animated Patchwork Girl maybe, but there's very little for the amount of material there. So I think sometimes you like it's the daunting of going up against this like iconic cinematic version, and some of it is the inherent nature of that story. And I think to some degree it's a dense story, right? It's a story where if you actually take the book itself and go, well, how are we going to, like there's a lot in there that you can stage. It's like when you go to the sequence where she grows, like you're getting all this stuff about like drugs, like all the stuff we have in our heads, because it's such a powerful thing over the years. And then you're going, well, how can we get some of that into this adaptation? And I
Mm-hmm.
think Tim Burton tried to do that to some degree. Um,
But I had the same, I mean, with Tim Burton's movie and the success of that movie, it pushed a lot of people away from trying a new version of Alice or the Looking Glass Wars,
mm,
especially with directors, because, oh, Tim Burton's movie made, $1 billion. But having done the sequel and having now it's many, many years later and seeing other reinventions come out, and that there's nowhere to go. As you said, there's no story engine to keep driving the Wonderland mythos. I think people see that.
right. And to me, that was the most powerful thing almost instantly with your material that I felt. Well, the first thing I felt was like why didn't I come up with this idea? Like that was I think that was one of the first things I said to you,
You
like
did, yeah, I
was like,
remember that.
yeah, it seems so obvious, like the true story of one, like it's even like you can even present it like with that kind of cheesy type, like
Right.
Alice in Wonderland, the true story, right?
Except, to make that, to suspend disbelief in that storytelling, you really have to work with the the reality that Lewis Carroll and the books had with the real Alice Little, and then play with the fiction of it.
Yeah, and that was an exciting thing that you did, and that's something that's part of the Alice in Wonderland myth in and of itself, right? So, if you go a little deeper, like you encounter that. And so that's why I was jealous, was because you were taking on like two levels of the myth at once and then finding a way to tell a story. But then when I looked at it more deeply, I'm like, oh, but you've created this like story engine stuff,
Yeah.
like that you can keep going back to. And that to me was the most impressive thing. And I think I demonstrated in the book we're doing that like it really is like a massive story, and like it can just keep going and going.
I don't think I realized until my first book, the first book was published in the UK, and I went to a school event, and there was a very eager boy with raising his hand, and he wanted to ask me a question. And the question was, how come I didn't finish the book? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, you just did a recap of Hatter's 13 years. He's my favorite character. You should go home and finish those 13 years and include them in the book. And I'm like, how old are you, kid? And 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 then I realized on the plane ride home that that was a really strong story engine, because it's such a long period of time that they're separated, and just started to imagine who are all the people he would have met in our world at the time, and
Hmm.
collected the friendships and influenced and left a wake of mythology behind him. And that's when I realized that this story could be infinite.
Hmm.
When he met President Lincoln or Jules Verne, and Jules Verne was inspired to write one of his books because of Hatter. I said, you can kind of do this,
Hmm.
endlessly.
And those 13 years on Earth are like one of the most important 13-year, because so much changes.
Right. The
You
Industrial
have like,
Revolution. Yeah.
yeah, you have the Industrial Revolution taking over the world, at that time. And then you have astronomy taking on. Like, there's just so much stuff that didn't exist at the beginning. Uh, you know, uh, pistols, revolver pistols. Like, there's just on and on. One of the things I know that when I was doing research, I would always have to like double check, like, does this exist at this time? And
Right.
and I'd be like, oh yeah, so I've got to do something. And I told you like that I was always trying to make sure that everything in the book fit all the other material that's already out there.
Hmm.
So I was always doing little things to make that work. And I remember like I discovered that like Budapest did not exist. It
Right.
was Buddha and Pest.
That was my mistake. I
Yeah.
did not do as
And
much research as you did.
and
How
so
lame.
but I like covered your
Oh,
ass because I like put in a line about how like people are already starting to call it Budapest.
you
So
called me and you busted my ass so
yeah.
bad. You were like, "Oh, do you want to know one of the many mistakes you've made? I'm going to fix for you."
But it's indicative of that period that like that a lot of stuff is changing, and so that's another thing that makes the Hatter story so exciting, because he's a catalyst, but he's living in a time of catalysts and a
Right.
time of imagination. And one of my feelings always about your story is it's about recapturing the imagination for our culture.
Yeah.
That we have gone through. The 20th century was a century of imagination, and the 21st century really hasn't been. And in fact, it's been a century so far of reversion,
Yeah, of killing imagination, and
of killing
you
imagination.
really feel it in culture, and the need, to break out of this. I mean, if I use political terms, the partisanship and the extreme language that's used, it's not the imaginative way to solve solutions. So I
Hmm.
think it's I had this quote: "Fantasy just declared war on reality," and I really never thought it would apply to day life, and a
Hmm.
political, leader the idea the fantasy just declared war on reality. We have been living that for 5 years.
Yeah.
And
And it started, remember, I mean, Karl Rove, to get on the political side, I mean, he talked about like people who lived in the reality based community.
yeah.
He was not somebody who lived in the reality based. So yeah. And for me, like one of the exciting things about the story is about like seeing how important that is, how like the destruction of imagination, like what it can do to a world, and what just one girl who has this great power of the white imagination, what she can do on a positive side for the world. And the people that surround her. I mean, one of the great things in the Hatter stories is this thing you invented, follow the glow. And the glow is basically an imagination, it's something that he can see that indicates that some kind of a special
Mm-hmm.
imagination is going on. And that idea to me was like, was very exciting, and that's another little thing that I was always wanted to return to, and Hatter, I even have a point where like Hatter wants to return to that, right? Like, what am I doing? Because he's not always like on top of things, right?
Yeah. So, one of the probably the number one question that people have for me is, why hasn't this been turned into a movie, or when is it going to be a TV show? And, I try to, you know, let folks know that we have been working on it. You were invited to the writer's room. I had Ed Dector on as a guest recently. And, when you're in a writer's room, you're really trying to solve, the questions and the problems of what the story presents and how to break it into episodes. In this case, we were trying to do, I think, 10 episodes, 8 or 10
Mm-hmm.
episodes. Um, but as well as I do that trying to catch the zeitgeist of the timing when the business is ready, when the creative is ready, how those come together, the right medium, whether it's film or television in this case,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe a musical. Any of those three, I think this material would, if crafted correctly, would really work. Um, but it's not so easy to crack the that timing.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to like, the problematic thing always about this stuff is everything you just said, but then on top of that, like you've got to remember why this is special,
Right.
right? Like because you can get into situations in a writer's room where you're talking about a third act problem here and like a mid-season issue, and you need to do that thing and step back, and it's like, why are people watching the show? Like
Hmm.
what is the reason that we're excited about this,
Why do they tune in each
Well,
each each
why do they
week?
tune in, and
Yeah.
why, I'll pair it, we all like watch shows where we go, what happened in that room? Like,
Hmm.
like that this is what they came up with. Like they literally had something fantastic, right? Because that's why they got to do a show, right? Like seriously, people don't like give you money to do a show if you don't have something fantastic. Like I know people don't understand that because the stuff they see at the end may not be fantastic.
Right.
But the thing that drives the start of a movie or a television show is a fantastic idea to begin with. And so that's a problem because we're so, those of us who've been around this material are so close. And even if you're not, even if it's a new thing, just the process of going through it, you know, makes you contemptuous of your own thing. And you have to have that thing of stepping back and looking at what is this magic, And I remember, and we've done that for each other throughout the years we've worked together, where like I've said, like you're missing, like get back to the basics. Like,
Yeah.
what is this story about?
Hmm.
And that's something I do in writing in general. Like, even when I'm writing a scene and I'm stuck, I go, well, what is this scene about? Like she has to walk across the room and get out that door. Like that's literally what, and sometimes that's true. It's like that simple. and you've turned it into this crazy thing that, and then you can simplify it to that.
Yeah. So, and the other part of it also, because I've been on productions and you get the studio notes, is there's sometimes a chipping away at the core idea that you don't
Hmm.
even recognize because they're just little paper cuts, right? And then they add up and you have this huge wound and you're like, why did we go off in that direction?
Yeah,
How
I
did
mean, and
that happen?
that's sort of the famous like blame game is like
Yeah.
it's all the suits, and it's true, like that's an issue, but like the suits want to have a popular thing that they can talk about at
Yeah.
their parties. Like they don't want a bad show,
I'm not saying
and
that I'm indicting them. But
they're not writers,
yeah, but I mean, even when I have lots of producer meetings and I see us doing it. I see myself doing it.
Mhm.
It's to your point. It's you become contemptuous of when you're like, well, I've already done. I've been living there for so long. Something grass is greener on the other side, but it's not necessarily. To your point, you got to keep coming back
Yeah, I
to
mean,
what are the basics.
one of my lines in collaborations always is, and I probably said it to you, is like, are we making this better or are we just making it different?
Yeah, that's really true. Very true. Often you're
Because
just making it different.
and one of the things I've learned, like as I've written for years, is that um like this is a record, although I want it to be this lasting thing, it's also a record of who I was when I wrote it. Like,
Hmm.
and if I go back and rework it like years later, like I'm denying that creative person who doesn't exist anymore. And that was the person who went and worked on it every day, and not me.
So, what do you think Lewis Carroll would say if he was here, given everything we've been doing with his story?
I don't, I think he'd probably be like more interested in where mathematics has gone. Like that would be his. I think he would be like, but wait,
Yeah.
it's like spooky. Like there's a thing, and if you look at, wait. Like I think that's what he lost it.
Yeah.
And some of the imaginary number and some of this like amazing stuff that's happened in mathematics, and because he was a mathematician. So
Yeah, I think
I
you're
think
right. I think he would say that his Wonderland has, survived for 157 years. Let me go off and do something more interesting in mathematics. That's a great
and
answer.
I mean, I think he would be. I think he was a person who was very like, amused by the world that he lived in, and I think that if he saw what we were doing, he would get a kick out of it. He 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 wouldn't necessarily say that's what he would do, but he would say, well, it's for your world. I mean, we have to remember that he made massive changes between Alice Underground and Alice in Wonderland.
He did, yeah.
And so he was not adverse to like rethinking. The Tea Party doesn't exist in that original manuscript. Like
Yes, correct, right.
that's like, so that's like an amazing thing that he leap of imagination. And I know that part of it was just there's like mundane levels where children's stories usually have like dinner scenes, have some kind of food scene. And didn't have one of those. It's become like one of the most iconic elements, and you would think like it would have been there.
Right. Well, David, this has been really a joy to talk about your work and our collaboration and Alice in pop culture.
I think that listeners can see how we've collaborated for so long because we just got through an hour and a few minutes without like
Stopping
any issue.
with no issue.
And we probably didn't even cover half the things that
Yeah,
we could have.
we absolutely haven't, but hopefully they're interesting to the listeners. And I will end with because of what you were saying about your imaginative, your childhood love of writing and continuing that into life. That it's something that Harry Miller said, and that's imagination is the voice of daring. And I think that's been very true in your work. And it's been a pleasure to collaborate and to chat with you today. So thanks so much, my friend. And don't screw up that interview of mine.
Okay.
Take care, brother.
Bye-bye.
Later.